Where's your playlist taking you? Down the highway? To the mountains? Or just into daydream mode while you're stuck in traffic? With over 4,000 hotels worldwide, Best Western is there to help you make the most of your getaway, wherever that is. Because the only thing better than a great playlist is a great trip. Life's the trip. Make the most of it at Best Western. Book direct and save at bestwestern.com.
How many discounts does USAA Auto Insurance offer? Too many to say here. Multi-vehicle discount, safe driver discount, new vehicle discount, storage discount, legacy.
How many discounts will you stack up? Tap the banner or visit usaa.com/auto discounts. Restrictions apply.
Find the biggest voices in sports on the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Like the Nat Coombe Show, where the stage is well and truly set. It is Super Bowl time, people, and we are your all-access pass to everything. All the key matchups you need to know about, plus all the hype you can handle from the biggest show on earth. So get set for the biggest game in sports. Search the Nat Coombe Show and listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to Hurley, the podcast. It's Martin here, and we've got another episode of On This Week for you today, where we take a look back through the archives and have the crack about some of the memorable and some of the not so memorable things that have happened in the history of Sunderland AFC. And as usual, I've got a couple of chaps alongside me today to help me rake through all of these stories. So first of all, we'll say good morning to Andrew. Hello, mate.
Hello, good morning. Good morning, Martin. Good morning, everyone. I'm looking forward to this. I think it should be a good episode.
No, it should be a very good one. If a little rundown that Kelvin's just given us before we started recording is anything to go by. And of course, Kelvin is the other person in our glorious trio this morning. Hello, Kelvin.
Morning, lads. Morning, listeners. Just getting the door open to room 101 there.
And just to let everybody in on a little bit behind the scenes stuff, normally we can all see each other when we are recording our podcast. Kelvin is using a different laptop today. The camera is not working, so we can't see Kelvin. We have been assured that he hasn't gone off to Turkey to have a hair transplant or anything like that, so we'll take his word for that, but we'll have to see what emerges next week on screen when we get back to business as usual. Over the course of the last few days, we've had a couple of bits of correspondence I just want to touch upon before we get cracking. The first one was from a chap called David Keeler, so thank you, David, for getting in touch. And Andrew, he got in touch with us to tell us, I think we were talking about high-scoring draws, and David's got in touch with us to say there was a 5-5 draw at Middlesbrough in October 1936, which is a fairly high-scoring draw, isn't it?
Yeah. Some game. I mean, we were the league champions. We were going to win the FA Cup that season. And as if that wasn't enough entertainment, they thought they'd throw in a 5-5 draw for us down at Middlesbrough. Yeah, David was very, very kind to get in touch, said some nice things about the pod. But yeah, we'd been speaking about high scoring draws, and he quite rightly pointed out that was one we hadn't mentioned. As well, a mate of mine called Michael reminded me that in more recent times, we of course had a 4-4 under Tony Mowbray against
the Hull City game. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that just like the draw against Middlesbrough in 1936, it just I don't know how, but it slipped my mind.
No, it's always nice to get correspondence and get people getting in touch. So yeah, if you do have anything that you'd like to share with us as we go through the podcast, please drop us an email, howwearthepodcastsafc@gmail.com, or you can get in touch with us on social media. As a chap called Carl Kennedy, I presume it's not the doctor from Neighbours, he tweeted us on X, and I loved this one because he reminded us about Danny Diccio's signing. And in the press conference, Diccio was asked why it hadn't quite worked out from Sampdoria. And the reason was that the manager kept playing a 3-5-1 formation.
Well, hey.
To which Peter Reid replied, "You're not that bad, are you?" And we can all make our own minds up about whether he was or not. Now, Andrew, you left us with a quiz question at the end of last week's episode, didn't you, mate?
I did, but I've got a question for you. Carl Kennedy, famous character from an Australian soap. Are you sure that's not just you digging Danny Diccio out again?
I've been found out, haven't I? My pseudonym has been ruined.
Exactly, aye. No secrets from us. Also, of course, Danny Diccio played in a 4-4 at Wembley. Another high-scoring draw.
That's true.
And that was the end of the game. It was a 4-4 draw, and nothing happened after that. And we all moved on. Yes, right. Quiz question. Yeah, I think it was about 3 weeks ago we finally moved on. The quiz question last time out was based on a transfer that took place on the 6th of February 2004. When our current first team coach, Michael Proctor, he was a local lad, he'd come up through the ranks at Sunderland. He left the club to join Rotherham as part of a swap deal, and I asked which striker came to the Stadium of Light in place of Proctor.
It was Thierry Byfield, wasn't it?
I better just check my notes, because I'm sure my notes said he was called Darren. But
that's right. That's right.
I'd never heard him called Thierry Byfield before.
I was in the away end of Burnley towards the end of that season, and Byfield played, and the chant was Thierry Byfield, Thierry Byfield, Thierry Byfield, Thierry Byfield. So I can say it had some validity to call him that. Andrew, you and I a couple of weeks ago started digging into Mr. Smith stuff. I think it was to fill Kelvin's absence more than anything else. But I was looking through the archives, and there's a couple of bits that we technically should have covered in last week's episode, but they were to the end of the previous week. So I'm just going to touch upon them now, because we obviously had all of the stuff about the Mr. Smith letter and that getting sent to the FA. It got published in the newspapers as well. In response to that, the Football League had launched a preliminary inquiry, and they spent a couple of weeks going through the books at Roker Park. At the end of January, they announced that the FA and the Football League were going to hold a joint investigation. So the Football League had a look at the books, had been raking over them for a couple of weeks and thought, something's not quite right here. So they got together with the FA from the Football League headquarters in Preston, the FA in London, appointed a joint committee to rake through the books. This, of course, sparked a few things going on. So there was a 3-hour board meeting at Sunderland on the 31st of January. So this is obviously a couple of days before this week that we're talking about, but it's close enough. And there was a full attendance of the directors of Sunderland Football Club for their weekly board meeting at Roker Park last night. This was reported in the Journal. And said earlier yesterday it was announced that a 6-man joint commission representing the Football League and Football Association is to conduct a special investigation into the affairs of the club. Last night's meeting began at 5 o'clock. 2 hours later, a director, Mr. W.S. Martin, rushed out of the club offices and left by car. He was followed at 7:30 by the club chairman, Mr. E.W. Ditchburn, and the secretary, Mr. George Crowe. A smiling Mr. Ditchburn was asked, "Have you any statement to make about the Football League probe?" He said, "What's the test match result?" It sounds like a bad game of consequences, doesn't it? But anyway, the report says, "I told him what the test match result was." At 7:35, another director, Mr. S.S. Collins, left Roker Park, and then manager Bill Murray. Then directors Colonel J. Turnbull and Mr. L. Evans. And at 8:30, the vice chairman, Mr. S. Ritson, and directors Mr. J. Parker and Mr. J. Reid left, and each bade me a cheery good night. Later, at his home in Thornholme Road, Sunderland, so this is another address published in the paper, which seemed to be common at the time, I asked Mr. W.S. Martin whether he would allow a journal photographer to take his picture. Mr. Martin said, "Don't talk to me about Roker Park. I've had enough of it. And you men." And then he brushed past his black Scottish Terrier and slammed and locked the door. So it's quite funny when you kind of read stuff like that in press reports now, isn't it? But you can kind of get a sense of the the angst, I think, that was building up at the club. I think they thought that this initial inquiry by the Football League would kind of get things ticked off and it'd be all okay. They've spotted something, appointed jointly with the Football Association, a 6-man committee to look into things more thoroughly, more firmly. The club have responded with a board meeting, and you even tell by the different directors leaving at different times. Some people had stormed out, some people were pissed off with each other, whatever. You can read between the lines, can't you, with that sort of stuff? And I find it interesting that they decided to go to the home of Mr. W.S. Martin and probe him a little more. So you can tell things are starting to pick up a little bit with this. And obviously, over the next few weeks, the Commission will be delving into the books at Sunderland. And obviously, we all know what happens, but it's just interesting to read the stories that are published in the paper and what's actually released in the press.
Yeah, you're right. The story's warming up quite rapidly, and it's interesting to hear all these little tidbits that kind of get brushed over when you look at the main headlines. Bill Martin there, that's really interesting about him and how he was the first to leave, and he was the one who the papers then decided to go and doorstep. I mean, it sounds a bit like Roy Keane when he went to walk his dog after the whole World Cup carry on, which is it's just come out as a movie, that story, hasn't it?
It has.
But yeah, there's Bill Martin with his dog by his side. The reason that intrigues me is Bill Martin, I think, was at the front and center of all of this. He was often the one that accompanied Ditchburn to some of the meetings and answered some of the questions on behalf of the club. And one of the strong rumours at the time was Bill Martin was having personal disputes regarding business in the town. And one of the constant whispers that got said was that Smith had some sort of personal beef with him. And that was what prompted the letter to go into the authorities in the first place. It was almost to get at him rather than to get at the club. And the person who did this felt that Bill Martin would be made an example of. And it sounds there straight away, doesn't it, that he could very well have been having to answer some difficult questions in the boardroom, or he's been asked to leave the meeting early so other people can speak about him. We'll never know the full details, but that really, really has got my attention, the fact that he was such a already being seen as a pivotal figure in this whole saga.
No, it's intriguing. And on the 5th of February, in the Daily Express, this is definitely in this week that we're talking about, so it's a nice segue into it. There's an article by a chap called Jimmy Guthrie. Now, Jimmy Guthrie was a former Portsmouth player, but he was head of the Players' Union, so what is now the PFA. And he'd been sacked from his job the previous week for defending Trevor Ford. Now, Trevor Ford had been suspended by Cardiff, and Trevor Ford wasn't actually a member of the Players' Union, interestingly enough, but Jimmy Guthrie had stood up for him and had been sacked because of this, right? So, Trevor Ford had been sacked by Cardiff, and Trevor Ford had talked about why shouldn't the player be paid what he's worth, be free to join another club when his contract expires, and be free to negotiate his own contract. Now, these are all things that are completely accepted and rightly the way that football's ran these days. We're all very accustomed to players having these things that they can do, but at the time they couldn't. This is what Trevor Ford was basically sort of rallying against. But interestingly, further down this column, and it's all about Trevor Ford to start with, and it says, Ford has been driven out of league football, so have I, but the flame of freedom lit by Ford may yet be kept burning by the inquiry ordered into the affairs of Sunderland. I know there are important people in the Sunderland club who would welcome a complete overhaul of the transfer, wages and contract system. Sunderland, who since the war have spent more than £300,000 in buying stars, would have no objection, I'm sure, to the stars getting a fair share. Chairman Mr. E. Ditchburn proposed at the last annual meeting of the league a first step. Make wages on par with pre-war values, he said. This would almost double the present maximum wage of £15. Many other clubs want to pay players more. So I found that really interesting that Sunderland at a league meeting had been proposing to change the rules and regulations about what players could be paid, and whether that was in a little bit of defence after the fact or whether that was a thing that they actually genuinely thought. It doesn't seem uncommon in terms of an approach that clubs wanted to take. See, Fulham there, he references Tommy Trinder at Fulham, who wanted the same thing. So Sunderland have been pushing this at Football League meetings as well. And obviously it all kind of came to a head. But I found that bit interesting as well because Sunderland were sort of siding with the players in terms of let's be able to pay these players what they are worth in terms of the business.
Well, again, that's fascinating, Martin, because who knows? Whilst Fulham were on board with this suggestion, there might have been other clubs who weren't so keen. And I was thinking, oh well, lads, let's just keep this quiet. Let's not talk too much about increasing wages. So, Sunderland could again have made themselves a target by being so open and upfront, and it's made other clubs think, oh, we could do with shutting them up. That whole thing from Jimmy Guthrie there is fascinating because Jimmy Guthrie isn't a name that I'd ever heard of in connection to this story, but he's been impacted. He's lost his job. The consequences of this whole situation, again, is quite wide-reaching when you look just beyond the headlines. Individuals are being punished. And it's quite interesting that from his point of view, he's talking about things like fair share for players and what have you. He obviously thought that this was going to blow the system wide open and benefit the players and be a good thing, this story. But in the end, what happened is the authorities, rather than look at this and go, oh, do we need to revise things? They've just thought, right, let's just throw the book at Sunderland. I'd always assumed that Sunderland were being criticised publicly by other voices, but it sounds as if there was maybe sympathy for Sunderland, sympathy for the players, and an expectation that this might have been a good thing and that by making this story public, everybody was going to benefit from it. But now they've just gone, right, let's damp down this story as soon as possible. Let's throw a fine to Sunderland and hope that that's the end of the matter.
Well, when you kind of read into it, it does seem that Sunderland were used as an example to try to quell that uprising of people challenging the current system and the status quo. And of course, in a few years' time after this, the whole system gets abolished and players, the minimum wage is abolished, isn't it? And players can have a certain amount of freedom, certainly not as much as that they have now. That was obviously the Bosman stuff in the 90s, wasn't it? But it kind of set the ball rolling for that. But it's just interesting how it's developing. And say the number of people, we look at it very much from a Sunderland point of view, don't we? And it's interesting the repercussions it has, the whole scenario has on different people in different clubs. And it's certainly one that we are going to track over the coming weeks.
Was Wee Jock the Scottish Terrier all right after he's fright at the front door? Or?
We will never know that unless that is on the back pages, and I haven't snipped those pages. Who knows what happened to the terrier? Maybe
I don't think there wasn't the interest in animal welfare probably back then.
Maybe the terrier was Mr. Smith. Eh? Yeah, the terrier could have been Mr. Smith. Maybe that's a mystery solved.
There you go. You've blown the story wide open now.
Yeah. Barking up the wrong tree there, boy.
Hey, it's not a bad name for a dog, though.
Mr. Smith.
Maybe we've uncovered something here. Right, we will start the show. February the 2nd, 1895. And this is a result and a scoreline and a game that is ingrained into most Sunderland supporters' minds. 1895, Sunderland 11, Fairfield 1. Record first team victory. Jimmy Miller scored 5 of the goals in FA Cup first round tie at home. Jimmy Hanna got 3, James Gillespie, John Scott and Andy McCready got the other goals. Interestingly, Andy McCready was a defender. And at half-time, Johnny Campbell saw the way the game was going. He said, come on, we'll swap. I'll go into defence, you go up front and see what happens. And yeah, McCready got a goal. 1920, George Hardwick was born in Saltburn. Hardwick, of course, had a brief spell in charge at Sunderland. He had a bit of a pivotal role in bringing Brian Clough through the coaching ranks and giving him a start in coaching. I was going through Brian Clough's autobiography the other day, and he said even to the day it was written in the early 2000s, I think George Hardwick at every event would always say, just remember, you owe me everything. You wouldn't have had any start in coaching if it wasn't for me. So, George Hardwick, tongue-in-cheek, I suspect, took a bit of credit for Brian Clough's subsequent managerial success. 1985, Sunderland had a game at home at Roker Park against Stoke City. We won 1-0. Dave Hodgson scored against a former Sunderland goalkeeper. Any ideas who that goalkeeper was, chaps?
Oh, was it? I was at that game. Was it Barry Siddle?
It was Barry Siddle indeed. And Steve Bold and Keith Burchin were also in the Stoke team that day.
Hey.
2002, Joachim Bjorklund made his debut in a 4-1 defeat away at Manchester United. 2016, Wabi Kazri, Lamine Kone and Dame Ndoye made their debuts at the Stadium in a game against Man City. And in 2019, Sunderland beat Wimbledon 1-0 at home in League One. There's more than 30,000 people there on that occasion. Aidan McGeady got the goal, and Lewis Morgan made his debut for the club on that occasion. Ooh. Now, February the 2nd, 1955, Joe Bolton was born in Burtley, and on the same day, Andrew, Sunderland lined up against Preston in the FA Cup.
Well, I wonder if Joe Bolton's dad was there at the birth or not, because, yeah, on the same day, we had this big cup tie, and it seems as if half of the town took the day off work to go to the match. This was an era, where the FA Cup was massive, but floodlit games were not common, so midweek replays had to be played during the daytime. Now, of course, I think if that were to happen now, there'd be absolute uproar, because so many people now take going to the game for granted, whereas back in those days, if you couldn't just throw in a half day to go to the match. So yeah, I'm not sure that would quite happen now. We played Preston originally at their place, and it was a 3-3 draw, which prompted the replay, and talk quickly got round the town that this was going to be a big game. Lots of people wanted to be there, so it got to a point where businesses were like, we're going to have to do something about this. We're going to lose so much of our workforce. So I think normally you'd probably get into a bit of bother if you just decided to drop a shoulder and leave at lunchtime to go and watch a football game. But most companies ended up just having to accept it. The game itself was 2-0 to Sunderland, so Ken Chisholm scored both goals. There was 57,432 in the ground. Of those, about 40% of Duxford Shipyard was at the game. They reported their workforce was down by 40%. Pickersgill's Yard had a third of their men off, and Lang's claimed around 500 blokes didn't come in, didn't report for the afternoon, and just went to the game. Throughout the town, throughout industry in the area, it's a similar thing. You've got these huge drops in attendance at work. Steele's Engineering reported large-scale absences. The Bristol Aeroplane Company in Pallion. This was quite a nice story, actually. A load of Newcastle fans offered to do extra work to allow their colleagues that supported Sunderland to go to the game. So that was a rare sign of friendship across the borders between Sunderland and Newcastle. There was a forge, T.S. Forster and Sons Forge. They opted to close because around 90% of their male employees were due to go to the game. And somebody we've already discussed there, Chairman Bill Ditchburn, his fortune was made in furniture. He closed his furniture factory for the afternoon of the game to allow staff to go to the match. He was probably quite happy that a lot of the money he was paying out in wages were then just coming back to him via the club and via the turnstiles. Although Ditchburn rather unfairly did tell his staff that they had to make up their hours during the rest of the week. So they were allowed the afternoon off to go to the game, but they had to work the time back. Apparently there was 10,000 fans locked out, couldn't get into the ground, and there were touts doing a roaring trade with 7 shilling tickets being sold for up to 25 shillings, which is a canny big markup there. So the touts have done well out of it. Local industry hasn't done well out of it because it sounds as if most places just gave up for the day. It just really drove home to me just how important the football club is to the town and is to the community. And we often hear, don't we, about how results can improve productivity. And if Sunderland are doing well, everybody's turning up to work full of joy and they're putting in extra graft and spirit is high. Well, this was the other way around, where a game actually meant no work was getting done. And I don't know, I just thought that was really, it said a lot about the connection between the town and the people and the club. And that was all of the stats there about adults who went to the match. I'd love to know how many school kids just so happened that afternoon to have dental appointments or had very genuine reasons why they needed the doll off. And, oh, wow, there's a surprise. There just so happens to be a Sunderland game as well. Oh, I might go and catch that whilst I'm out of school.
At least they wouldn't have been caught on TV, would they? That's the thing. It would have been far easier to get away with it in those days, wouldn't it?
Probably turned up in the ground and then saw the teacher stood at the front shouting and bawling at the players and thought, well, if he's here, I'm all right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, when the power strikes were on, you were making us think about that period, and they played some games in the middle of the day, and I was twice caught. I stayed on the bus instead of jumping off at Gosforth to go to school in South. I went to school in South Gosforth by the ministry, and from Morpeth, I just stayed on the bus and went through to Newcastle and then straight down into the central station to catch the train to Sunderland for the game. I was twice spotted by a teacher in the central station with my Sunderland scarf on. And you would think I would learn, if I just keep the scarf off. I'm not attracting attention to myself, but I twice. One thing I was wondering about the attendance at that game, and did all the doctors go because it was a riveting game?
Ah, dear me.
Martin, isn't it funny because we can't actually see Kelvin, so there's just this voice coming across the airwaves with these little one-liners and what have you. It adds to something, Kelvin. I don't know quite how, but the fact that we can't see you on the screen is just adding to your mischief, I think.
And do you know what as well? We always put it down to the look in Kelvin's eye when he's about to do a one-liner. It's actually the intonation in his voice.
Yeah.
You can spot it a mile off without even seeing his face there. So there you go.
Yeah.
I tell you what, Martin, I bet his teachers were secretly pleased when he missed the day because he was because he was at the match thinking, we might actually get some work from the other pupils now that he's not distracting them all.
Well, I'd tell you what, I'd 6 of the belt off that bloody music teacher that caught me. Boy, you bugger. Yeah, I used to think he was a big soft lump. He didn't half whackers, I tell you.
Must have been a mag, Kelvin.
Aye.
We will take a very short break then. Be back soon.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Kids. They grow up so fast. One day they're taking their first steps. And the next, they don't fit into the tiny sneakers they took them in. You blink your eyes and their princess dress is 2 sizes too small, and their dinosaur backpack isn't cool anymore. But don't cry because they're growing up. Smile, because you can profit off of it. For real, there are a bunch of parents on Depop looking for the stuff your kid just grew out of. Download Depop to start selling.
Every sip of Coca-Cola brings you closer to the excitement of the FIFA World Cup 26. Because nothing compares to the joy. So grab a Coke and drink in the FIFA World Cup 26. No purchase necessary. 13 plus in 50 U.S. states and D.C. with a web-enabled device. Ends March 1st with 8 entry periods. Rules at cokeurl.com/soccerrules.
Welcome back to How We're the Podcast, and you are joining us for another episode of On This Week. Now, February the 3rd, 1901, Ernie England was born. Now, Ernie England holds a record for the most appearances for Sunderland as an outfield player without scoring a goal. He made 352 appearances for the club and didn't register a goal once. I think John Kay came relatively close to surpassing that. Not quite, but I can't think of many other players who played that volume of games who have come close to that, or come close to registering the number of games without scoring anyway.
I'm not going to say anything, because when we spoke about the high scoring draws a few weeks ago, I think I very confidently said, no, I can't think of any other high scoring draws we've had. And of course, there was loads that hadn't come to mind. So you can forget me coming up with any gems in this one. I'm going to keep me powder dry and try not to embarrass myself.
We'll see how long that goes. Andrew said that in 31 minutes and 7 seconds. So.
How many games?
Anybody can take some bets on the time that Andrew says something to slightly embarrass. You never embarrass yourself, Andrew. That's all good. 1934, Sunderland beat Aston Villa 5-1 at Roker Park. Rach Carter got 2, Patsy Gallagher got 2, and Bert Davis got the other. Now, the 1937 Cup run isn't one that we've talked about too much. We've talked an awful lot about the 1973 Cup run, haven't we? Either on the website or on the podcast. But in 1937, Sunderland played Luton Town in an FA Cup 4th round replay at Roker Park. We beat them 3-1. Len Duns scored on 3 minutes, and the chap called Joe Payne equalised on 6. Jimmy Connor put us back in front on 18. And it must have been a fairly tense and tight game because Rach Carter only added the third on 87 minutes. That would have been, that was a midweek game, so that would be an afternoon game, presumably at this time of year. Obviously, no floodlights. 53,235 there on that occasion. So I think there was a few businesses in Sunderland who probably didn't get the work done that they were expecting before the draw down at Luton. 36 years later, in 1973, Sunderland played Reading in the FA Cup. 4th round cup tie, and Charlie Hurley returned to Roker Park. This was a 1-1 draw. Les Chappell put Reading in front after 13 minutes, but Dennis Stewart equalised on 38. And I know, Kelvin, you've written about this cup run in depth for the website, haven't you? But Charlie Hurley's return to Roker Park must have been a brilliant occasion to be at.
It was, Martin. It was a moment, I think, in our history, a moment that said a lot about the relationship between the fans and him. I don't know anybody else that, an opposing manager walks out of the tunnel and the whole of the bloody home crowd absolutely roaring his name. It was a noise that was just as loud as the noise for Chewett's goal. It was a fantastic moment, a real good moment, a nice moment to see, a memory, that one.
Indeed. And a well-deserved ovation as well for Charlie Hurley. 6 years after that game, Sunderland played Burnley at Roker Park. We won 3-1. Leighton James opened the scoring early on for Burnley. Gary Rowell got a penalty. Wilf Rostron scored, and another goal from Wayne Entwistle gave the lads a 3-1 win. Now, 2007, Sunderland beat Coventry 2-0 at the Stadium of Light under Roy Keane. This was a season that Keane arrived after a pretty terrible start to the season under Niall Quinn's unique role as chairman/manager. But he got the team up and running again, and Dwight York and Carlos Edwards, two of his signings, scored on this occasion. Another Trinidad and Tobago international, Stern John, made his debut for Sunderland that day. And what was interesting about that was because we'd signed him from Coventry. So he made his debut against his former club that he just left. Danny Simpson, who'd come on loan from Man U, also made his debut. But Kevin Kyle was in the Coventry team that day. Now, at the start of the season, our opening game was away at Coventry. Stern John was playing for Coventry. I think he scored in that game. And Kevin Kyle came off the bench for Sunderland. So while it might not have seemed that way on the opening day of the season, Stern John would go on to play quite an important role, probably quite an underrated role in our promotion that season, because he added something good to the attack. He scored a few goals. And I think Roy Keane didn't quite fancy Kevin Kyle when he came in and he departed for Coventry. Now, just a year ago, on the 3rd of February, this was the game at the Riverside, where we beat Middlesbrough 3-2. Dan Neil got the goal to open the scoring for Sunderland. Wilson Isidore got the lovely goal where he got put through from the halfway line and dummied the keeper a little bit and slid it past him. And then a fantastic own goal very late on from Ryan Giles gave us a 3-2 win, and cue celebrations and Wilson Isidore putting his shirt on the corner flag and winding up the Borough fan. You know what? I was convinced that was going to come back and bite us in the arse come the playoffs. And I'm so glad it didn't. But yeah, Wilson Isidore certainly enjoyed himself that night. Now, February the 4th, 1904, Andrew McCombie. Andrew, we've spoken about him a couple of times, and the cloud that he departed under. He left the club on this day in 1904 to join Newcastle for what was a record fee of £700. And there'd been disagreements about payments and all that sort of thing, hadn't it? But it's still one that was actually a big moment in Sunderland's early history, wasn't it?
It was, and here we are, over 120 years later.
Still talking about it.
Yeah, because he was a good player for us. Let's not forget he was an important footballer. But the way he departed and the disputes over money and this feeling that some money that he'd received from the club, he claimed it was a gift. The club said, no, it was a loan. We expect this money to be repaid. That caused a lot of bad blood. That caused him to report the club for some of their payments and business practices. So yeah, there was huge fallout from his move. Didn't help, of course, that he went to Newcastle. There's always been the relationship with Newcastle has always been tense, even when the two clubs are rubbing along relatively nicely. I think if ever one player moves from one to the other, it's going to raise eyebrows. And yeah, here we are all these years later, and like the Smith saga, Sunderland maybe didn't always learn the lesson when it came to how they paid players, and it's fascinating that we're here now together, remembering these stories all these years later.
Yeah. It was an intriguing story that it piqued my interest when you mentioned it. I think that got a mention in the last pod, so much so that I think tomorrow that will be the On This Day article. I've delved into that a little bit and had a bit of a ferret around some of the material that's there. It's not as straightforward. I think you've done quite a good job at telling us that it wasn't just about the £100 loan. There seems to develop arms and legs. And, is it the first illegal payment scandal that Sunderland get involved in? I'm not so sure, but an intriguing story and an intriguing fella. I would expect that he's somebody that Newcastle fans, I don't know whether they have a similar pod to this one, but if they do have, he's a guy that they should be talking about and writing about, because he offers them tremendous service after he leaves us. But intriguing fella, a fine looking fella as well. He was a handsome chap, wasn't he?
McCrombie, of course, went on to join Newcastle, as Kelvin said. He played over 100 games for Newcastle, but he spent pretty much the vast majority of the rest of his life on the coaching staff at Newcastle. Shortly until his death, he was a coach there. He lived in North Shields and passed away in North Shields in 1952. And interestingly, at the time that he was sold to Newcastle, the fee that they paid for him was a world record transfer fee.
Well, again, money comes to the fore, doesn't it? Doesn't matter what era we're talking about, money plays a part in football. I'm going to enjoy reading that article, Kelvin, because it's a really important and complex story. So I'm gonna look forward to reading that article. But you said there that he was a handsome fella. That's not how it works. If you leave Sunderland to join Newcastle, nah, you're not handsome. Maybe if you've left Newcastle and joined Sunderland, you go, whoa, what a guy he is. What a man. Doesn't he look good? He's got everything. But nah. If you're going to go and sign for the Mags, you're not getting any compliments from me about your appearance.
Interestingly enough, his last goal for Sunderland was a penalty in a 1-1 draw at Roker Park against Newcastle on New Year's Day in 1904. So just a month before he signed for them, he scored a penalty, and that was his last goal in professional football. So at least there's something there you can cling on to in terms of that. He never scored another goal. Serves him right.
Exactly. I think that's a warning to all future players considering crossing the divide. Clear evidence there that you go backwards as a player when you sign for that lot, and you lose your goal scoring touch.
It gets worse. It gets worse for him. I'm sure he scores an own goal for Newcastle for us in his first game. But I must check that out. Yeah, and that case was covered heavily in the national press at the time. It wasn't just local papers and the sports pages. It was front and second page news in the national press. So there was a lot of interest in that case. Very interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. 1931, Sunderland played Blackburn Rovers at Roker Park. We beat them 8-2. We were 7-0 up at half time. Jimmy Leonard scored 3, Billy Eden scored 3, Bobby Gurney got a goal, and the chap called Joe Devine scored in his debut. He went on to play 77 times for the club and scored 7 goals. Now, talking about transfers between Sunderland and Newcastle, 1948 on February the 4th, Len Shackleton did the journey the other way, crossing the Tyne and heading to the more beautiful and brighter and eloquent and everything part of the Northeast, signing from Newcastle for a British transfer record fee of £20,050.
If there is a rival Newcastle history podcast, are we now trying to start some sort of beef with them with all of these digs about how how it's more beautiful down here and we're all more eloquent and what have you? We could be causing a bit of interpod rivalry here, I think.
Well, if there is one, bring it on. That'll be good fun. 1967, Sunderland played a 2-2 draw with Liverpool. Bobby Kerr opened the scoring for Sunderland. Ron Yates and Peter Thompson put Liverpool 2-1 ahead, but John O'Hare got the equaliser for Sunderland. And Billy Hughes made his debut for the club on that day. 1984, Sunderland played a game at home to Liverpool at Roke Park. And that was a big day for Craig Russell. Now, you might be thinking, that's far too early for Craig Russell. But it was Craig Russell's 10th birthday, and Craig Russell was the mascot on that occasion. So if you've got any programmes from the game after that, there might be a picture of Craig Russell in there with the captains and the referee and all that sort of stuff. But a lovely birthday for Craig Russell on that occasion. 2012, Sunderland played Stoke at the Britannia Stadium. We won 1-0. James McClean got the goal. That was the game that Robert Huth got sent off just before half-time. I think it was was it on David Myler? He got an awful tackle. He slid through. Tony Pulis, of course, said it wasn't even a foul, never mind a red card, but it was certainly the latter. And Sunderland won 1-0. And in 2017, this result in this game stands out a mile in this season, doesn't it? You've got David Moyes taking Sunderland down to Selhurst Park. Sam Allardyce has recently been appointed as Crystal Palace manager, only 6 or 7 months after leaving Sunderland to get the England job, then drinking a pint of wine and losing the England job. But Darren Gibson, Julian Lescott and Brian Oviedo made their debuts. And at half-time, Sunderland are 4-0 up away at Crystal Palace. Lamine Kone, Didier Ndong and Jermaine Defoe got 2 in a minute. As we raced to a 4-0 half-time lead, we kept that scoreline at the end of the game. You think, this is it. We've turned the corner now. This trip to New York for some cold weather cycling or whatever they did around Central Park, this is going to make all the difference. Moyes is a genius, and of course we returned to form very, very shortly after that. We will move on to February the 5th. Now, 1907, Jimmy Miller. Now, this is a player who we've mentioned in pretty much every podcast, I think, when we go through games from this era. And we mentioned him at the top of this pod, scoring goals against Fairfield in that 11-1 win. Now, 1907, Jimmy Miller, aged just 36. He's a trainer at Chelsea. He's on the coaching staff at Chelsea at this point. He passed away from tuberculosis. So, 36-year-old, after having such a good career at Sunderland, to pass away at such a young age is really a horrible thing. But yeah, Jimmy Miller passed away in 1907. 1921, Sunderland played a game against Arsenal at Roke Park. We beat them 5-1. Charlie Button got 2. Bobby Marshall got a goal. And a chap called Billy Moore got 2. Or Billy Moore, we'll say. Now, Billy Moore, I hadn't heard of this name before. I hadn't really registered at all, but he played for us from 1914 to 1922. Now, of course, that was interrupted by the First World War. He played 47 games and scored 11 goals. Now, he left Sunderland for West Ham and played for West Ham from 1922 to 1929. He scored 48 goals in 202 games for West Ham. So he's a big player for West Ham in the 1920s. He got 1 England cap and scored 2 goals on his only game for England. After retiring from playing, he joined West Ham's coaching staff. He was assistant trainer briefly, and then he was appointed head trainer, which wasn't manager, but he was obviously the head coach, coaching the players, a position he held from 1932 to 1960. So he had almost a 30-year spell as a coach at West Ham after retiring from playing. He spent 7 years as a coach. So it's an incredible story for West Ham. I think when you kind of start digging into him at West Ham, he's very highly regarded still. But yeah, Billy Moore is not a player who I'd really come across before.
This is a complete shot in the dark because, this isn't a story I know particularly well. There's no way he's in somehow a relation to Bobby Moore, is there?
Well, that did cross my mind when I was looking through this. I didn't find anything to link the two of them together. Well, he's obviously got the right surname for success at West Ham. Maybe he paved the way for Bobby to be taken with open arms. But yeah, Billy Moore. There you go. Now, in last week's pod, if you listened to our podcast on this week last week, we covered the Chelsea game in which Jimmy Thorpe sustained the injuries which would subsequently lead to his passing. And on February the 5th, 1936, Jimmy Thorpe did pass away in hospital, aged just 22, after being in a diabetic coma. From the result, or as a result of the injuries he did sustain against Chelsea on that occasion. And if you did not get a chance to listen to last week's pod with the Jimmy Thorpe stuff, I'd suggest you go back after you've listened to this one, of course, and have a listen to that, because there was some fantastically good stuff in there about Jimmy Thorpe, which was great to listen to while it was being recorded and listen to subsequently as well. 1983, Sunderland played a game at home against Coventry. Stan Cummins and Gary Rowell got the goals in the 2-1 victory for the lads. In the year 2000, we played Newcastle at the stadium. This was a game where we were 2-0 down against Bobby Robson's team. Kevin Phillips got a goal back pretty much straight after they scored the second, then got an equaliser late on to give us a 2-2 draw. That was a great atmosphere, that, when we got that goal. And I just thought we were going to get the winner as we pushed ahead to try to grab it in the closing stages, but we just didn't get there. In 2011, Sunderland played another game at Stoke. This time we got beat 3-2. Kieran Richardson and Asamoah Gyan got our goal. Sully Muntari made his debut for us on that occasion. But in the Stoke squad that day, and I think we've talked about the maximum number of former or future Sunderland players in any sort of squad that's faced us. But in the Stoke squad that day were Danny Higginbotham, Rory Delap, Dean Whitehead, Kenwyn Jones, Thomas Sorensen, Danny Collins, and Mark Wilson.
Wow.
That's a pretty significant number of players with mostly former Sunderland players. There was Mark Wilson, obviously, who went on to have a glorious spell in red and white at the Stadium Light in a few years after that, wasn't it? But most of them are excellent players. So there's a record to be found somewhere. I'm not sure if that's it or we find more, but I'm sure it'll be a game involving Sunderland and Stoke if we do find more, because they seem to be a destination for players we didn't want for a number of years. Now, we've got an FA Cup tie against Oxford coming up in the next week or so, haven't we? And in 1992, on the 5th of February, Andrew, we travelled down to the Manor Ground to play an FA Cup tie against Oxford.
We did, and yeah, this leapt out at me for that very reason. Here we are in 2026, looking forward to a fourth round tie against Oxford, and we had a famous trip there in the same stage of the competition 34 years ago. It was when Malcolm Crosby's run was just starting to get a bit of lift off. He'd just become caretaker manager and was definitely enjoying a new manager bounce. So this was an era that I remember fondly. I was a young kid getting into football, and here Sunderland were going on this magical cup run. The team that day, when we were at the Manor Ground, Tony Norman in goal, John Kay, Gary Bennett, Kevin Ball, Anton Rogan. Another reason why I always remember this era fondly. All of these names were just, I don't know, just the names that were playing for Sunderland and the first names I fell in love with. Midfield was David Rush, Paul Bracewell, Brian Atkinson, and oddly, Paul Hardyman was in midfield. He was playing out on the wing. Up front, we had Peter Davenport. Now, Peter Davenport we're talking about our current cup form. Peter Davenport was at that game against Everton in the third round a few weeks ago. I spotted him just sat amongst a load of fans pre-game eating his lunch. His wife was absolutely, well, I hope it was his wife. I might have dropped him in it, but his...
It's all right. It's not a Coldplay concert, Andrew. It's a football match.
Yeah. His companion was dressed head to toe in Everton gear, so she was obviously supporting the home team. So yeah, that was quite odd, because I don't think many people had clocked who it was. And there's me and my mate wanting to go, oh, he's played for Sunderland in the FA Cup. So yeah, Peter Davenport was there, and up front alongside him, of course, was John Byrne, who was the star of our cup run. He was replaced with about 12 minutes to go by Colin Pascoe, and our unused substitute on the night was Richard Ord, who in later years became really good friends, and they were good partners on the pitch in defence. Really good friend of Andy Melville, who that day was playing for the hosts. He was playing for Oxford, but then when he came up to Sunderland and joined us, he and Richard Ord became really close. So yeah, like the Preston Cup tie I was talking about back in the 50s, this was another midweek date. This time it was under the lights. We had floodlights by now. It wasn't a replay though. The original was postponed due to poor weather. So this was actually the first attempt at play in this game. We hadn't already gone against each other in the cup that year. We had, though, only recently been away at Oxford in the league, and we'd lost really heavily. We lost 3-0, and that was the final straw for Dennis Smith. That defeat was one of the things that led to his dismissal. And now, here we are under his, at the time, temporary replacement, and we're not yet lost under Crosby. So, you could tell the team was suddenly full of confidence. I mean, how many times does that happen, lads? You can't get a win for love nor money. The manager moves on, and the manager must just go crazy when they're watching the results over the following weeks, because suddenly Sunderland become unreal. Full of confidence. Within 25 minutes, they're 2-0 up at Oxford. Now, I don't know if you remember this, lads, but we were actually wearing red shorts that day, and there's a little bit of footage available on YouTube of the goals. We go ahead, like in the first few seconds, really. Paul Hardiman, as I say, is playing in a more advanced role. He plays this really deep cross from the left wing, and sure enough, there's John Byrne at the far post to just tap it in. John Byrne couldn't stop scoring for Sunderland in the cup that season. If you find the footage, it's well worth watching because it's right in front of the away fans. And if you want to talk about old school limbs, there's a classic example, because John Byrne races towards the away fans. Everybody's going mental on the terrace. And there's John Byrne climbing the fences so that he can salute the away fans. Everyone's going crazy. That was pretty good scenes. Then Paul Hardiman involved again. He puts us 2-0 up with a really smart finish from a tight angle. Bernard burst into the box. Oxford couldn't live with him barely, but on that occasion they managed to block the shot. But as is always the case when things are going your way and you've suddenly got an injection of confidence, the ball just bounces kindly for Hardiman and he absolutely belts it into the corner. Puts Sunderland 2-0 up, and, you know, we're just unrecognisable from the team we'd been a few weeks ago. Sunderland are just suddenly playing all this free-flowing football. We get in at half-time 2-0. Now, Kelvin, I don't suppose you were at this game, were you? Can you remember?
I wasn't at this one, no.
Right. Well, you might not remember this, but do either of you know what happened at half-time? Peculiar story.
No.
No, nothing's springing to mind.
There was bizarrely, there was a bomb scare. There was a bomb scare rang into the club. Now, the Oxford players were already out on the pitch, ready for the second half at this point, but Sunderland's players were told to just stay in the tunnel when this news broke. So I don't know if the Oxford players were a bit like, oh, can we not get back to safety as well? We're the home team here. But yeah, there had to be a message put out on the PA system telling fans to check under their seats and to check around themselves for suspicious packages. It was quickly established that it was a hoax, that this call had been made maliciously, and the game quickly resumes. I'm just looking back on it now, though, I'm really surprised by how much it was downplayed. in that era, in the 90s, there were incidents of the public being bombed. You know, that it was a genuine concern. And I did a bit of digging on the archive. Even in that month alone, there was lots of bomb scares just in general day-to-day life in the country in February 1992. So it was relatively common. And I'm a little bit surprised how in that scenario, I think if something like this was happening in modern day circumstances, would the fans be asked to leave the ground or something? I mean, there was 10,000 people there, and there was like, you know, a few cursory glances, and it was found out that this was all a sick joke, and the game just went on. I'm not sure how it would have played out in modern times, and you've got Malcolm Crosby, this time of like presumably heightened anxiety. Apparently Malcolm Crosby and his opposite number, Brian Horton, are laughing and joking about it. Like Malcolm Crosby apparently jokes to his opposite number, Horton, "Are you sure you haven't done this, Brian, to get the game called off? Because we're winning." So yeah, it was quite peculiar. And when you're reading the match reports afterwards, they're all making jokes about that was the nearest Sunderland came to being under threat all evening, and Oxford didn't have any sort of danger behind them. And I don't know, it was all a bit odd. And I've tried doing some digging to see, was there an investigation into it afterwards? Was the person who rang it in, did they get into any sort of trouble? You'd think it was you'd think it would be a massive story, but I couldn't find any mention of it. It was almost as if, oh yeah, there's been a bomb scare. We're confident that it was just a hoax. However, lads, let's just move on and forget about it. It would be huge now. So a bit peculiar that, but anyway, listen, the game gets back up and running again in the second half. We're already 2-0 up. We're already in control. Brian Atkinson makes it 3-0 to really kind of rubber stamp it and confirm that we're going to go through. John Byrne had again been involved in it. He has this beautiful curled effort. He's a bit unlucky. It bounces off the post, but there's Brian Atkinson arriving in the box to stab it over the line. Oxford do, to be fair to them, they get a couple of late goals we're talking the real final throws here. Paul Simpson scores with a low shot, and then there's a really scrappy goal from a lad called Dave Penny. But we're talking about the last few seconds of the game here. Sunderland aren't under any real pressure. They're not really sweating. They know they've got the job done. And for the first time since 1976, there we are. We've made it through to the fifth round. And I dare say in a few days' time, I think we're playing on the 15th, aren't we? I think in 2026, I think we're playing on the 15th. I'm sure we'd all settle for another Sunderland win and Sunderland progress into the fifth round again. Although, dare say, we could all do without the stress of some idiot ringing in with some sort of daft bomb hoax. No, nobody wants to say that, thank you, but if you could repeat Malcolm Crosby's feat, please, Mr. Lebris, and get us a win in the FA Cup, that would be most welcome.
For a dynamite story, that one, Andrew.
Kelvin, how long have you been working on that one? Literally as soon as I mentioned the bomb scare?
Champing at the bit. I will say something to you, just a quick add-on to that. Excuse me. In 1992 at the Cup final, we all stayed at RAF High Wycombe. We took a minibus full and piled into my friend's brother-in-law's house. He was a sergeant in the RAF, and we had a muckle heavy night in the sergeant's mess. before the game. If I tell you at 1 o'clock in the morning, the bell rang in the bar, and I ran to the bar thinking it was last orders. And the guy behind the bar sort of smiled at me and said, "No, it's 1 o'clock in the morning." He says, No, it's half price drinks. So a muckle night ensued. And I remember getting up early. I didn't sleep very long and got up early the next morning. And it was like he lived on base, on camp, my friend's pal. And I'm sort of wandering about trying to get over me hangover, you know. And sort of almost subliminally, I'm thinking, but some of these lads are up early cutting the grass, you know. I'd seen about 3 or 4 people with what looked like stick fly mows, you know, and then I realised as I started to sober up, they weren't cutting the grass because there wasn't any noise. What they were doing, which sobered me right up, was they had mirrors on sticks, and the servicemen were going round all the vehicles, checking to see whether there was any bombs underneath the vehicles. And my friend's pal, who was a sergeant at RAF High Wycombe, had already done our vehicle before we jumped in it to go into Wembley. So it was a real and live kind of issue that at that time. It was the 92 FA Cup final, that one. Salute, it didn't half sober me up, I tell you.
It certainly would do, wouldn't it?
Mm.
And yes, if we can have an FA Cup run that even just goes one better than that 192, that would be pretty nice for 2025,
get in there.
26 season, wouldn't it? We will take a very short break then. Back soon.
We heard you. 9 years of Bring Back the Snack Wrap, and you've won. But maybe you should have asked for more. Say hello to the Hot Honey Snack Wrap. Now you've really won. Go to McDonald's and get it while you can.
TaxAct is here anytime you want to easily file your taxes. TaxAct is here for the early birds who like to knock them out as soon as the season opens. And for the procrastinators who like to wait until the very last minute. TaxAct is also here for the middlers who file right in the middle of tax season. No one ever talks about the middlers, but TaxAct sees you, and TaxAct respects you. TaxAct, let's get them over with.
Sports Social Podcast Network, the biggest voices in sport. Let's take a look at some of the lineup. The Anfield Wrap.
Liverpool are not equipped. That is a deliberate decision, and for me that is deeply unacceptable.
Football cliches.
Turns out that Rudy Voller was born son of Rachel and Derek Voller from Basildon and Hainault.
Tennis Unfiltered.
If Sinner and Alcaraz are turning up to tournaments and are bothered 99% of the time, one of them's going to win it.
All on Europe's biggest sport podcast network. Find your next favourite sport podcast. Search Sports Social Podcast Network and listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Sports Social Podcast Network.
Verified comparison at content.sport-social.co.uk/comparison.
Welcome back to How Are You, the podcast, for another episode of On This Week, and we are on February the 6th. Now, 1936, Charlie Thompson, who was Sunderland's captain in the 1913 FA Cup final, he passed away aged 57. 1954, Sunderland recorded 1954, Sunderland recorded the third successive victory over Portsmouth at Roker Park. We beat them 3-1. Now, we've talked in the last couple of weeks about Ted Purden. So I think he made his debut against Cardiff and scored a goal or two, and we beat them 5-0 from memory. The following week, we went to Highbury and he scored a hat-trick in a 4-0 win. Comes back to play against Portsmouth at Roker Park here, and he gets a goal in the 3-1 win. Billy Elliott and Len Shackleton getting the others. So that was Purden's 6th goal in his first 3 games for Sunderland. 1993, so just a year after the game that Andrew was talking about against Oxford, Gordon Armstrong and Kevin Ball achieved the dubious honour of both missing penalties in a game. Now, this was Terry Butcher's first game in charge. He'd been appointed as player manager, I think Sunderland's first ever player manager. And we played Swindon Town at home. We got beat 1-0. Terry Butcher should have been sent off. I remember him bringing down somebody who was clean through. And I think the referee took a little bit of pity on him and just gave him a yellow card rather than a red. Yeah, Gordon Armstrong, Kevin Ball missed penalties. One of them was in the very last minute. I think it was Kevin Ball took a penalty in the very last minute and failed to convert it. And that kind of it set the tone for Terry Butcher's spell in charge, really. 6 years. Sorry,
Nick Summerby was playing that game, wasn't he?
He was in the Swindon team, that's right.
And Glenn Huddle. Huddle was playing. 2-player managers.
That's right, and Huddle was absolutely superb. Like Swindon had a bit of a reputation, didn't they, for kind of making player managers popular? Because
Glenn
Huddle.
What was the name of that? Yeah.
Well, because Ozzy Ardiles had been in charge, hadn't he?
That's right. That's right.
And Ozzy Ardiles had been appointed player manager. He didn't play much for them. I think he played against us on the opening day of the season. We beat them 2-0 in 89-90. And Warren Hawke got, I think, his only goal for the club on that occasion.
Right.
But Ozzy Ardiles played in that game. I think he might have played a couple more, but he decided he couldn't manage both of those jobs together. He obviously went up the road, and to replace him, Glenn Huddle came in as player manager at Swindon. And Glenn Huddle was superb. And I remember watching him in this game. And there was a nighttime game at Roker Park as well. He played against us, and he was superb in both of them. And he, of course, went to Chelsea as player manager after this, didn't he?
Yeah.
And then Ruth Huller took over from him as player manager. So there was quite a sort of a popularity of having a player manager to get an exceptionally good player at the tail end of the career where they could still do some stuff on the pitch. Terry Butcher at Sunderland didn't quite work out in the same way as some of those.
Yeah. I was just going to say that, Osvaldo Ardiles, Glenn Huddle, Terry Butcher, it doesn't quite have the same allure, does it? But he was all right. He was brilliant that night, Huddle. They had a good team as well. What was that lad that we were always going to buy off them?
Martin Ling.
Martin Ling, yeah. Aye, we always seemed to be... how many years did that go on that we were going to buy Martin Ling? He was a good player, him.
There was three players in that era that I remember us being linked with, month after month, probably season after season, year after year. There was Martin Ling from Swindon. There was a lad called Bernard McNally from Shrewsbury, who Dennis Smith was very keen on, wanted to get. Paul Bowden from Swindon was another one that we kept getting linked with. I think he wouldn't come because of the playoff stuff, which was a rumour at the time. And John Frayne from Birmingham. We kept going back in for John Frayne and never got that one over the line either.
Yeah. He was a good player, Paul Bowden.
He was a very good player. Couldn't take a penalty
in this game.
Bowden, yes, he did. That's right.
He was a good player, him. I liked him.
Yeah. He was, unfortunately. He had a little spell at Newcastle, I think, at some point, and he also played for Crystal Palace. I think he was at Crystal Palace. Was he at Crystal Palace when Marco was at Palace? I'm getting seasons mixed up, but I'm certain he had a spell at Palace.
Yeah.
At some point. You say Nick Sumby was in the Swindon lineup that day, and Fraser Digby was in goal, and he saved Gordon Armstrong's penalty in the first half very early on. And that, we've talked about moments, haven't we? We've talked about moments this season relating to Sunderland, moments going your way. And you do wonder if, for Terry Butcher's spell in charge of Sunderland, Gordon Armstrong gets a penalty 11 minutes into Butcher's first game. If that converts, everyone's up on it. Everyone's enjoying the game. Everyone's thinking, this is going to be all right. And then Bawley's penalty in the 90th minute, which goes wide and doesn't even force Digby into a save. And you just got the sense of maybe it's not going to work. Terry Butcher got booked just after the hour for pulling. I can't remember which player it was he pulled down, but somebody was clean through on goal, going towards the goal, and Butcher just hauled him down. He was exceptionally lucky not to see red from the referee Kevin Lynch, who was a referee who turned up quite often at Roker Park.
Kevin Lynch is a name I remember. I've had a little look there on Wikipedia, and it looks as if you're spot on. Paul Bowden was at Crystal Palace for quite a short period, but it did coincide with Marco being there. And I was starting to worry Martin, because I don't think we've whinged about Marco Gabbiadini being sold to Crystal Palace for quite a while now. It's been a few weeks. But yeah, well remembered. Paul Bowden and Marco were there at the same time from what I can see here.
So Bowden must have had 2 spells at Swindon, unless he was just on loan at Palace, was he?
No, he did. He was at Swindon. This is just Wikipedia, but he was at Swindon 1988 to 1991. So was there during the 1990 playoff fiasco, fiore, whatever you want to call it. He was at Palace during early 1991. He then actually had a loan at Newcastle, as you say, but in 1992 went back to Swindon, played around 150 games for them, and then dotted around, had a couple of other clubs. He played a lot for Wales, and sadly for him, I think that's perhaps what a lot of neutral fans will remember him for. But he was a quality player, and I recall us being linked with him. And yeah, John Frayne was another name I remember reading in the papers back then, but wasn't to be for whatever reason.
Yeah, the ones that got away. Kelvin quite rightly pointed out that Nicky Sumby was in the lineup for Swindon in that game in 1993, and 6 years later, Nicky Sumby was in the Sunderland lineup as we played Swindon at the Stadium of Light. Niall Quinn and Kevin Phillips got the goals for Sunderland in a 2-0 win. Gareth Hall was lining up for Swindon. 2004, this is the answer to the quiz question here. On the 6th of February, Darren Byfield arrived at the Stadium of Light in a swap deal for Michael Proctor, who went to Rotherham. And 2010, Sunderland played a 1-1 draw with Wigan at the Stadium of Light. Kenwyne Jones equalised Mo Diarme's opener for Wigan. I think that was a great goal from memory, if I'm thinking of the right one. I think Wigan scored a superb goal to open the scoring on that occasion. Ben Jarney and Alan Hutton made their debuts. Both players Steve Bruce had signed on loan. They made their debuts for the club that day. February the 7th, 1906. This is an intriguing one to me. I don't know if either you, Andrew, or Kelvin know anything about this. In 1906, Sunderland apparently paid Gainsborough Trinity £300 to switch the FA Cup second round replay to Roker Park, as we had a poor away record. So we won 3-0 in this game, which, you can delve into the rights and wrongs of this, but they only took £244 from the game. So we actually lost out on £56, but we made it to the next round of the FA Cup, which doesn't quite seem right, does it? But there you go.
Well, I wonder if we can pay to not wear those black strips.
I think there might be a good cause to do that now. What once is just bad luck, but after a few occasions, you read things into it, don't you? 1914, Billy Moore, who we talked about earlier with his connections with West Ham, he made his debut for Sunderland against Sheffield United in a game that we lost 1-0 at Bramall Lane. 1959, Mick McCarthy was born, the former Sunderland manager, and of course, as Andrew pointed out at the top of the show, now the star, or you've got Steve Coogan playing him in a feature film now, haven't you, with I was reading something about that, actually. I haven't seen the film at all. I'm not sure whether I'm going to make a point of watching it, but they're saying that the dynamics of Steve Coogan and his height and the actor who's playing Roy Keane, Steve Coogan's obviously a lot shorter than Mick McCarthy is in real life, so you've got this dynamic between Keane and McCarthy in the movie that didn't exist in real life, whereas in reality, McCarthy towers over Keane, or has got a little bit of a height advantage over Keane. In the movie, Keane is more imposing than McCarthy, which kind of changes the dynamic somewhat.
There was a lot of Sunderland connections around Ireland at that time. So I am interested to see, does Niall Quinn get a role in the film? Who plays Niall Quinn and what have you? I know you said you're not sure if, excuse me, if you're going to catch it, but I do wonder if there's a bit of interest for Sunderland fans in that story.
No, there quite possibly will be. I did read a not so positive review about it, how certain things have been changed in it that aren't actually factually correct. So they made a story. They made a movie about it, and they've kind of pieced bits together that happened over the course of 2 years into a short window in Saipan. And it's not necessarily kind of technically correct to how things actually transpired. But I do like Steve Coogan, so we will see how I might change mine. I'll let you watch it first, Andrew, and you can give us a thumbs up.
We'll do a film review episode of On This Week one time.
Hey, that could be quite a good idea, couldn't it? In last week's episode, I think it was, we talked about John Hughes signing and getting injured straight away, and we said that Vic Hallam probably wouldn't have arrived at the club if Hughes had stayed fit. 7th of February 1973, Vic Hallam signed from Luton for 35 grand. And on the same day, Sunderland travelled down to Elm Park, because obviously we talked about the Reading game, Charlie Hurley coming back, the 1-1 draw. A few days later, we travelled down to Reading and we beat them 3-1 in the replay. Dave Watson, Dennis Stewart and Bobby Kerr put us 3-0 up in 29 minutes. And Kelvin, I know you were there for that one.
I was, and so was Vic Hallam. He was in the stand. He was spotted by at least some of the Sunderland fans, and it seemed like it was a quick response to Yogi's situation. As was said, Vic Hallam would never have been at Sunderland if Yogi had managed to get himself out of the woods and onto the pitch.
You've had all week to think of that one, haven't you?
Talking about that Reading game, apologies if I've misremembered this, but I think that same day, as well as sorting out the Hallam transfer, I think Stokoe ends up having to make a mad scramble to get Richie Pitt's loan at Arsenal cancelled. He'd only been there a couple of days. Now, I can't remember if he was injured in the particular game, but we lost David Young, sadly, recently.
Correct.
And I don't think we've spoken about him on the On This Week pod. If I've remembered the story, David Young played at Reading in this game, but then might have picked up an injury. And was that why Richie Pitt then had
No,
to
he
be
didn't.
McColl? Or have I merged a couple of things?
You merged a couple of things, but you're allowed to. I don't know whether David Young had travelled to Reading, but he never made it onto the pitch. Richie Pitt and Keith Coleman were on their way out of the club, but travelled, as my understanding was, they were going to be subs for that game because Bob Stokoe wanted to cup tie them before sending them to Arsenal. He didn't want them. He didn't want them playing for Arsenal in the cup against Sunderland. But Richie Pitt had to come in, and the rest, as they say, is history. He actually played really well that night. And I think the scramble went on after the game. I think Stokoe looked at the way Pitt played that night and thought, you know what, I think we'll need to keep this lad. Keith Coleman was allowed to leave on loan, but Pitt's loan move was cancelled, and that was him with Sunderland for the rest of the season. Yeah. He was a lad, Stokoe. He wasn't averse to. He had some stunts in him.
Well, Richie Pitt, and thank you for filling in the blanks there, Kelvin. I think I've put 2 and 2 together and come up with 73. Ironically, Richie Pitt, prior to this supposed loan with Arsenal, was linked with a loan to a club from lower down the leagues. So that whole thing's a sliding doors moment, and it's odd to think of two players who can't get a regular game in the second division and then going on loan to Arsenal in the first division, who, let's not forget, we then play in the semi-final. So I wouldn't mind knowing the full story there. Like you say, Stokoe could be a bit of a a canny operator. And yeah, while we're on the subject, obviously, best wishes to David Young's loved ones, because that was always a sad time when somebody from the club's history, and particularly that wonderful story. Very, very sad that he's passed away.
It is. No, that news arrived last week, I think, didn't it? So, yes, all condolences to David Young's friends and family. 1987, we're going to fast forward a few years. From 1973, Sunderland played a game at the Goldstone Ground against Brighton. We beat them 3-0. Eric Gates, Gary Bennett and Terry Curran were the goal scorers for Sunderland that afternoon. 1998, Sunderland played a game at Molineux and we won 1-0 with a cracking goal. I think if I'm remembering this goal correctly, it was a cracking goal from Kevin Ball with 2 minutes left in the game. Chris Lumsden made his debut, and that was his only appearance he made that season. Gareth Hall was in the Sunderland team. That was his last appearance for the club. But Don Goodman and Carl Robinson were in the Wolves team that day. And in 2009, we played Stoke City at home. Ricky Frazier was in charge at this point, and we beat them 2-0. Kenman Jones and David Healy scored the goals on that occasion. We will take another short break there, and we'll be back soon.
The world moves fast. Your workday, even faster. Pitching products, drafting reports, analyzing data. Microsoft 365 Copilot is your AI assistant for work. Built into Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and other Microsoft 365 apps you use. Helping you quickly write, analyze, create, and summarize. So you can cut through clutter and clear a path to your best work. Learn more at Microsoft.com/M365 Copilot.
Welcome to Sephora. I'm looking for a perfume that's not too perfumey. I got you.
Serum moisturizer or moisturizer serum.
Let's get into layering.
My concealer is making me look worse.
Sounds like the wrong shade. Let's get you matched.
There's only one store that really gets what you're going for. Get beauty from people who get beauty. Only at Sephora.
Hi, let's get you a basket.
Welcome back to Hurley, the podcast, for the last day of the week that we're covering in this week's episode, and it's February the 8th. Now, 1936, we covered Jimmy Thorpe in the Chelsea game and everything that happened surrounding that last weekend. Obviously, we touched earlier upon the day that he actually passed away. Just 4 days after this, I find this incredible. 4 days after your 22-year-old goalkeeper dies after an incident that happened the previous Saturday, the team are playing a game at Anfield. Liverpool versus Sunderland, a game at Anfield. The team are expected to play as if nothing's happened, which I just find incredible. But Sunderland were 3-0 up after 21 minutes. Bobby Gurney scored 2 and Patsy Gallagher got a goal. And it stayed as 3-0. But you can't imagine what the mood and the feeling amongst the players and the staff, and Matt Middleton, who had to replace Jimmy Thorpe in goal, what they were all feeling. It must have been a horrendously hard thing for them to go through, but they won 3-0, and I'm sure they used that as some sort of motivation or what have you to try to honour Jimmy Thorpe in the best way they had at their disposal. 1975, Sunderland beat Cardiff 3-1. Tony Towers scored a penalty, Pop Robson got a goal, and Cardiff scored an own goal for us on that occasion. And we spoke about Bob Stokoe and his bag of tricks there, Kelvin, earlier. In 1983, he was in the away dugout. Sunderland played a 2-2 draw against Carlisle. Bob Stokoe was in charge of Carlisle. And the interesting thing about this game was that Alan Kennedy scored both goals for Sunderland on that occasion. They were his only goals for the club. So he did it in one game, knocked 2. Apparently the second one was a pretty spectacular goal, Kelvin. I don't know if you recall.
It was a cracker. And it was like back to the Kennedy of old. It was like something from the previous decade from him, because he didn't half wallop it. I think we had Stokoe was in the dugout. I'm sure Jackie Ashurst, and did John Cook play in that game as well? I was at that game. It was a good game.
Yeah, there was a few Sunderland players, or former Sunderland players, in the Carlisle lineup that day. I'm just checking
Yeah.
back on the dates. I think I said 1983. I think I meant 1986 for this one because it was
So
certainly
McMenemy and Stokoe were in the opposite dugouts, weren't they?
So 1986. That was the 2-2 draw with Carlisle, and if we'd had Alan Kennedy in 1983, we probably would have got an awfully different player because by the time he arrived at Roker Park, he was a shadow of his former self. I think that is fair to say.
Yes.
2003, Sunderland played a game at Tottenham Hotspur, White Hart Lane. We got beat 4-1. Interestingly, it was the first appearance for Tahal El Kakouri, who was Sunderland's first Moroccan international. Obviously, we've got past that now. Emerson Thome made his last appearance for the club. Kevin Phillips got our goal, but Gus Poyet opened the scoring for Spurs on that occasion, and Glenn Hoddle was the Spurs manager that day. So he'd obviously gone from Swindon, being player manager of Swindon 10 years previously. He was in the Spurs dugout at White Hart Lane. I think I always thought he was a good manager, Glenn Hoddle. I think he kind of got tarnished with a few things around his Eileen Drury beliefs and all that sort of stuff, didn't he? But he was I thought he was a pretty good manager for club and for country. And in 2022, Trey Hume made his debut for the club. This was the game immediately after Lee Johnson got sacked, I think, wasn't it? We had an away game at Cheltenham, and Mike Dodds was in charge. We went 1-0 up with an Alex Pritchard goal, but Cheltenham got 2 goals back, and we lost 2-1. But yes, that was Trey Hume's debut 4 years ago today. And also on February the 8th, in 1968, Kelvin was very sad because his favourite ever Sunderland manager left Roker Park.
Yeah. Get room 101 opened. Oh, man. Yes, he did. He did leave. And when Andrew was talking earlier about his memories of the first team that he watched, this lad, John Miller McColl, went by the name of Ian, but his actual proper name was John Miller McColl. He was the first manager of Sunderland when I first started going in 1965-66 season. So I've like fond memories and attachment to the team, but behind the scenes, what the blimmin' shambles was going on, Well, I tell you, it is interesting, and it has made me look a little bit closer at Ian McColl's career and the man behind the infamy, if you want, for me. One thing I would say is when Sid Collins, the Sunderland chairman, appointed him in May 1965, I think what's clear is that he was one of the most respected and admired figures in Scottish football, with a burgeoning reputation on the world stage. He was articulate and intelligent football man with a good reputation in the game as a player and as an international manager. He'd managed Scotland from 1960 to 65, having assisted previous manager Andy Beattie at the 1958 World Cup in Sweden. Ian McColl had gone as a player coach, you would probably call his role, and he'd been offered and accepted the international job when he retired from playing in 1960. He still figures statistically as one of the most successful ever Scottish managers, with a win ratio of over 60% by my reckoning. So he was a figure of some standing in the game at that time. I mean, one of the things in Scotland that gave him enhanced his fame was victories over England and winning the home international championship twice in 1962 and 1963.
Sorry,
and
Kelvin, your line broke up there. Victories over who?
Victories over England.
Oh, you had to get that in, didn't you?
My line didn't really break up there, did it? You've been switching me off. Stop switching me off.
It was wishful thinking at that point. But only joking.
But the lad, Ian McColl, he obviously had something with the Scottish team. And it was a highly successful period for Scotland. And apart from the victories over England and winning the home international in some style twice in a row, 1962 and 63, there was also a victory against Spain in the middle of all that. Scotland hammered Spain 6-1. And it was a huge match for Scottish football that, and for McColl, because Scotland played great that day. It all added to his growing reputation. In 1962 as well, he was unlucky not to guide Scotland to the World Cup finals in Chile. Scotland actually lost out in the playoff to a very good Czechoslovakia team, who actually, if you know your World Cup history, were beaten finalists in 1962. Pelé in Brazil beat them in 1962. But to provide some context for his success with Scotland, you have to look at the players that he had at his disposal. And let me just fire some of these will mean something to listeners. You know, he had access to players like John Gregg, Billy McNeill, Paddy Crerand, Dennis Law, Billy Bremner, a great Scottish player forward called Davy Wilson, Charlie Cook from Chelsea, Jimmy Johnson, Willie Henderson, Alan Gilzean, who Sunderland almost bought, cracking centre forward, Eddie McCready, Bobby Murdoch, and I'm going to mention John Yogi Hughes again. John Yogi Hughes was capped whilst McColl was the Scotland manager and scored goals for Scotland. Two more boys, not mentioned there, but who would have an impact at Sunderland during McColl's reign, Neil Martin and, of course, Slim Jim Baxter, who would impart their own footprint on Sunderland's history. So his appointment as Sunderland manager, and my understanding was that was the 21st of May 1965. That appointment, there's a relevance to that. Scotland were in the middle of their 1966 World Cup qualifying campaign, and by all accounts were looking, although it was a tough group they were in, there were favourites to, get past Italy, or at least make it to the World Cup. There was a lot of pressure on for Scotland to get, but the shock of him resigning from the Scotland post and taking this job with Sunderland in the May, it was a shock in Scotland. I remember my dad talking about it and actually blaming him, using it, saying that that was the reason Scotland didn't qualify as for the 1966 World Cup, as well as the fact that any Scottish players that played for English teams, the English teams wouldn't release them for World Cup ties, apparently, allegedly. There definitely seemed to be some issue there. That was my dad's excuse for why Scotland never qualified for the 1966 World Cup. He blamed McColl and all the English teams that wouldn't release their players. But the timing of that did raise some eyebrows. It's interesting looking back on it, though. The 6,000 per annum 5-year contract that Sunderland offered him probably had something to do with the timing of that. That was a whopping salary and a hefty contract that he was given to go and become the manager. Another moving part in this, and you mentioned that his name earlier, George Hardwick, who'd taken up post temporarily this season before. He'd done quite well when the team were struggling when he'd come in and looking like they were going to go straight back down. George Hardwick had managed to guide the team to 15th in mid-table safety. And Len Ashurst, who I plucked from his autobiography, Left Back in Time, because I knew he'd had things to say about Ian McColl. And but he told this story about when George Hardwick was still the manager, albeit temporary. At the end of the season, Sid Collins and the board of directors took the team and Hardwick, the backroom team, to the 1965 FA Cup final for the weekend. And the night before that final, Sid Collins had wined and dined the team and Hardwick in fine style and spoke really eloquently and at length about the job they'd done in turning the fortunes around and keeping the club in the first division. And he'd waxed lyric about Hardwick on the Friday night, and on the Monday he sacked him. So Sid Collins, there's a lad. Were we talking about the Mr. Smith situation earlier? Oh, aye. Anyways, Sid Collins does play a role in this, in that it's him that offers Ian McColl the job. If you didn't know it, Ian McColl was a footballer of some renown. He was a Rangers captain and a Rangers legend. He was born in Alexandria. If that rings a bell with you, it's where one of our legends, Bobby Kerr's from. And obviously McColl would give Bobby Kerr his debut at Sunderland. No bias there, I'm sure. No bias. McColl had a 15-year Ibrox career from 1946 to 60-61 season, winning 6 league titles, 5 Scottish Cups and 2 League Cups, as Rangers became the dominant force again in Scottish football. And he was a big part of that. He was an integral part of the famed Ibrox Iron Curtain, they were called. And he was a right half. There was the goalkeeper, Bobby Brown, fullbacks, George Young and Jock Shaw. Fellow halfbacks, Willie Woodburn and Sammy Cox, made up this Ibrox Iron Curtain, they were called. And they were meant to be as impregnable as the Eastern Bloc Iron Curtain was at that time. He played 526 games for Rangers. And as I say, he was... what brought him to the attention of the Scottish FA was Andy Beattie, the Scotland manager, picked him as a player for the 1958 World Cup in Sweden. And McColl took on this role alongside Beattie as kind of a senior player coach role. He really enhanced his reputation during that World Cup as Scotland, whilst they didn't necessarily get results, they certainly got performances. And he was 14 times capped for Scotland, McColl. So he was a player of some renown and some standing in the game. When he came to Sunderland, he was 38 years old. He'd never had, when he took the Scotland job, he'd never had another manager's appointment. He'd never had a managerial role in the game. He went straight from the Scotland job into the job at Sunderland.
It struck me, sorry, Kelvin, just his age. Because I always, you kind of assume that, you've appointed the Scottish national manager without looking too deeply into it. I always thought, he must have been maybe mid to late 40s. But it really stuck out to me that he was 38 when he joined.
Well, he when he finished playing in 1960, he'd literally just finished playing for Rangers. He played his last game for Rangers in the 1960 Scottish Cup. He'd been a bit part player in that season, but had come back in for the cup final and played right half for them and went out. It was a real swan song, He went out and helped Rangers win the cup in 1960. So he was in with the bricks at Rangers. He was a Ranger and a legend there, but he'd no managerial sort of grounding. He went straight into the Scotland job. And at that time, and I don't think many international teams were that different. I think this happened at England as well. The team was picked by the SFA directors. The manager as such made recommendations to that committee and they picked the team. So we're talking about a different era in terms of managers and coaches and what have you. And he definitely had a little bit of experience in 1958 at the World Cup. And as I say, he was a Rangers captain of some renown. So, for what experience that was there. But anyway, I'm thinking that the contract and the money that he was paid was a massive inducement to come. There's also, Martin, I cannot find any firm detail of this, but there is a suggestion about there's like a chicken and egg thing going on with Jim Baxter, because I don't know that whether Sunderland had some discussion with the Rangers board about possibly buying Baxter before McColl became the manager. So there seems to be a suggestion that almost like McColl came as part of the package. McColl he had experience of Baxter over his time as Scotland manager and managing him internationally, and that McColl came as part of that package. But I must say, I haven't found that definitively recorded anywhere. It's just more suggested that discussions had already started with the Rangers board about the transfer of Baxter, who himself had been a Rangers great, but had burnt every boat that he had with the Rangers board and had, was really on his very last legs with Rangers. Scott Simon, the Rangers manager, was past himself. Couldn't manage his antics off the pitch anymore, and they were desperate, just about desperate to get rid of him. And what I would say to you is, Ian McColl will have been well aware of that and the reasons for why. Because when he was the international manager, there were a number of instances about issues when Baxter travelled. I mean, McColl, he benefited from Baxter's performances on the pitch internationally. Baxter played some fantastic games for Scotland between, in that period. I'm trying to remember 62 to 67. He played some fantastic games for Scotland, and he seemed to always be able to strut his stuff on the pitch. But off the pitch, his vices would have been well known to Ian McColl. There's a story about, I think they are in Hungary. They play a double header. They go to Austria and Hungary, and I cannot remember which way around those games go. So they play the game on the night, I think the draw, and they're back at the hotel and the players are getting ready to go out for a drink after the game. And McColl pulls the squad in and basically tells them to screw the nut, and that he expects that they'll all be back in by midnight. By 2 o'clock. It's very generous, by 2 a.m. because they played an evening game. And then in front of the whole squad, he addresses Jim Baxter and points at the clock. And he says, Jim, you need to be back in here when the big hand's on 12 and the little hand's on 2. I expect that you're in your bed. Okay. Next morning, all the players are at breakfast. McColl's sitting getting his breakfast, and in comes Baxter, the worse for wear. He's just coming in from his night out. He hasn't been in his bed. And McColl sort of starts to get up to say something to him, and Baxter points him in the direction of the clock, which has no hands. And Baxter drops the hands on the table. He says, there you go. and goes off to his bed. He was impossible to just keep a handle on, especially when he did like a drink, Baxter, and he had a huge range of stunts some of them fun. You know, there's definitely players that would tell you he was great fun and great fun to be around, but that, like a lot of people, it could go too far and he would drink so much and then the black dog would be on him and that could be trouble. So McColl was well aware of all the difficulties, but this is what he said about his appointment at the time. I'm quoting from him here. He remembered about the moment of his appointment. He said, Sunderland appointed me to turn them into a successful First Division club. That is what they wanted, and they made that quite clear to me at interview. For my part, I wanted Jim Baxter to be the man I would build my team around. Sunderland had some good players at Roker Park, solid, experienced professionals. But I knew if we were going to achieve our ambition and make our mark in the top league, that which was very, very strong, we would need better players. My belief was Jim would help us do that. He was a special player, second to none, and I had first-hand knowledge of that from the time I spent with him as Scotland manager. He did have first-hand knowledge of it. He saw what happened on the pitch, couldn't be argued with, but he also saw what happened off the pitch. And with the benefit of hindsight, McColl's well-intentioned error, let's call it that, of signing Baxter, it would prove his undoing and arguably knock the club back years. So it would. The board backed him. He backed McColl. They paid $72,500 to buy Slim Jim, transfer record at the time, who he more than doubled his weekly wage, which was a big part of his issues with Rangers. Baxter, he more than doubled his weekly wage, as well as allegedly pocketing a sizable signing-on fee and, according to a number of people, including Len Ashurst, under-the-counter payments. So we've learnt nothing from the Mr. Smith situation where we're not even a decade past that and we're back with these allegations of under-the-counter payments being made. Baxter publicly, and this, I guess, is where as a young lad, I can definitely remember this, being around with him publicly. He was a mega superstar. He was a personality built for the swinging 60s. He'd a beautiful new wife, the fancy car, the clothes, and the talent to burn in that left foot that he called the claw. He was a fantastically gifted player. But behind the scenes, you know, McColl hitched his career to a flawed genius, a character with an addictive and self-destructive tendencies, irrespective of his undoubted skill and talent on the pitch. And McColl, I never understood, not at the time. I was just a lad at the time with stars in my eyes. I mean, I thought the sun shone out of Baxter's backside, watching him play. I think part of the trouble is it seems like McColl thought the sun shone out of his backside as well and was a bit blinded by that. You know, McColl realised too late that Baxter was the star that he thought he'd bought, wasn't going to rescue, wasn't going to bring Sunderland the success that he wanted. Were there positives to his time at Sunderland? Yes, I think I've been able to find one or two positives, The 45,000 of signing of Hibs centre-forward Neil Martin was definitely a positive. This lad could play. This lad was a good, if not a great centre-forward. This lad scored 100 goals in Scotland and 100 goals in England in the top tier of both leagues. He was a really, really good player, a really big player who could have had a bigger impact at Sunderland. And I'll tell you we'll come back to this. We had a player called Nick Sharkey who was in our squad when McColl came. And he was a forward who would have been just about the perfect foil for Neil Martin. Just about the perfect foil. But McColl wouldn't play them, would hardly play them together, and wouldn't play them. And all the time Neil Martin was with us, there was a struggle to find the right partner for him up there. Primarily, we're playing this new 4-4-2 formation, and they just couldn't find he couldn't find the right player to play up there with Martin. But let me tell you, this lad was a fantastic centre forward. I'd speak about him, in my opinion, I haven't seen them all play, in the same breath as Niall Quinn. He was a target man centre forward, same breath as Niall Quinn, but up there with the likes of Gabbiadini, Kevin Phillips. He was a star, this lad, and we should have gotten more out of him. Other positives, McColl, he gave debuts to some smashing young players that were already at the club. You know, they'd already been bought in by Alan Brown and Charlie Ferguson, but Colin Todd, Colin Suggett, Bobby Kerr, Billy Hughes, they all got debuts during McColl's reign. They were all smashing players. He also blooded players like Alan Gowden, was a good player. Jimmy Shoulder and Malcolm Moore were three other young lads that got a go during McColl's time with the club. Right at the end of his time with us, he was the manager who pursued and bought Ian Porterfield. We've got another Ian, John, that's called Ian. So he did bring Ian Porterfield to the club from Wraith Rovers. But by that point, you know, the writing was on the wall. It was probably £45,000 of the estimated £250,000 that he spent. That was £45,000 probably well spent in hindsight. The negatives, I mean, how many do you want to, you know, it's easy for me to play with these negatives. There's lots of them. There's lots of ammunition. But you look at the basics, things like in 65, 66, we finished 19th. In 67, we finished 17th. And then in 68, we finished 15th. But the improvement came in the second half of the year when Alan Brown had returned. You know, if we'd the point at which he was sacked, we were on our way down. So it was Alan Brown that brought about the improvement. He won 39 games, he lost 59, and he drew 27. They are the facts of his tenure with the club. The players that he bought, he kept making the same mistakes, you know. If Baxter was a mistake, and who could have seen that it would have panned out the way it did? You know, he repeated mistakes. He bought Ralph Brand in. And now, Ralph Brand had been a really, really good player with Rangers, but he was a drinking buddy and a lifelong pal of Jim Baxter's. And he was a drinking buddy of Baxter's during that time. And he bought Ralph Brand in. Brand had gone to Man City and not had a good time there. And he spent money on Ralph Brand towards the end of his period as manager. He bought Bruce Stuckey in. I think he got a mention a while back. There was just nothing about that lad. There was nothing. Kelvin Palmer from Stoke. You'll probably get some people that would say that was money well spent. It was £70,000 that he spent on him, and I don't know that it was money well spent. Jeff Butler, who he bought from Chelsea, he never liked Len Ashurst. You know, if he could avoid playing him, and there's reasons for that we'll come on to, but if he could avoid playing Ashurst, he would. He was always looking for somebody else to play in his position, and he spent £65,000 on Jeff Butler. I think it was his last signing. That lad cost £22,000 a game in 1967-68 season because he only played 3 games for the club. It was a scandalous waste of money at the time. He bought Gordon Harris from Burnley. Gordon Harris, respected figure, but was well past his best by the time he got to us. And if Ralph Brand was his Baxter's drinking buddy, to compound the issues, he brought George Cannell to the club. Now, there's a lot of people who'll say it, and I remember watching Cannell play, and on the pitch, he was a functional centre-half on the pitch. He was a functional centre-half. But he bought him, I feel, for two reasons, looking back on it. One, to challenge Charlie Hurley. Now, that can be both a good and a bad thing, but he bought him, it was Charlie Hurley's position that he played him in. And he was also Jim Baxter's cousin and big drinking buddy. So he was just fueling the issues and didn't seem to want to deal with the issues, with the drink culture. I mean, one of the things Charlie Hurley has nothing good to say about Ian McColl. I think the nicest thing he says in his autobiography is he's possibly a nice man to know socially. That's as good as it gets from Hurley. But what he says was he ushered in period of piss artists, and that's what he says in his autobiography. Now, that's Hurley. Hurley liked to drink. He liked a pint or two, but he did it. Yeah, I'm told that he did it after the game when he had a day off. He would take his wife out and go to Weatheralls and go to La Strada and places like that and have a nice time with his wife and have a few beers. But he wasn't on he reckoned that McColl ushered in an era of piss artists at Sunderland. Pretty harsh stuff. As I say, looking back, the money that he spent, and one of the things that he does do, I think he's in panic mode coming towards the end of his time with us. He doubles his money. He sells Neil Martin, doubles his money, and then spends it on silly players. He wastes it, and then there's another issue that's infamous. We've talked about it on This Week. Was the 1967 USA tour. I mean, he just provided North American tour. If you cannot remember anything about that, Sunderland go, they present a team for a series of, it's round about, I think, 15 games in a de facto North American soccer league. And they go and play as Vancouver Royal Canadians for that summer. And the antics that go on that tour are the stuff of infamy. There's all sorts of things, players being arrested, assaults. The club, 6 months afterwards, according to Len Ashurst, 6 months after that tour, the club was still paying for the damage and things that had been damaged and wrecked whilst the team were in Vancouver. There was a young player had to be admitted to hospital, get his stomach pumped. As terrible performances, alcohol-influenced performances. And McColl seems to have had he presided over that. He had no control, no authority to manage that. And I'm told and I'm aware that he wasn't there all the time, that he dipped in and out, but it seemed to be avoiding the issues. Len Ashurst tells the story that before they'd even gone, McColl had tried to stamp his authority he called the tour party together and had said that it was going to be a dry tour. And in front of the whole tour party, Jim Baxter flew at him and said, one of the things that he'd said was, "I'm not going. If that's the case, I'm not going." McColl relents and says, "Okay, well, beer's okay." And Ashurst says he just McColl didn't have the skin to be a manager, was his view. And he said it was hard not to compare him with Alan Brown, the disciplinarian that was Alan Brown. And he said Alan Brown would not have brooked that kind of behaviour. He wouldn't have stood for Baxter's antics, and he would have either brought him into line and got the best out of him, or Baxter would have been on his road. McColl seems to have been unable to handle that problem. And he speaks himself about it. He talks about the police ringing him, and this is when Baxter was in Sunderland, and not when he was in America. The police did ring him when he was in Vancouver, but we're talking about the local police kind of had a hotline to him over this period. He would have to go and bail Baxter out of some kind of scrape or issue. His view was Sunderland was too small for the character that Baxter was. In Glasgow, he'd been able to sort of hide a little bit, but his antics were legendary in Glasgow. In Sunderland, not so much. He was getting himself into bother at, there was a gambling club, I've lost the name of that, and a local gambling club that he kept getting into bother with. He liked to gamble, Jimmy Baxter, and drink. Lots of incidents of drink. What also there was, which Blackmore, you can have a massive problem and struggle to deal with it, but he seems to have fed it a bit. There was a lot of rancor in the dressing room and two sort of broad camps, and he doesn't seem to have tried to have done anything about that. What he does seem to have done is visibly taken Baxter's part in all that. And people like Colin Todd, without, I guess Todd Oers, for instance, says, he talks about the effect that drink can have on you, and that he was always really sorry that we never saw the best of Baxter, and that McColl seemed unable to manage the difficulty. And he says that, that one of the things that he remembers happening and that he really, really struggled with as a young player was that Baxter would come and inform players whether they were playing that week or whether they were being dropped. And it would be Jim Baxter that would be letting players know whether they were playing or not. So he'd lost the dressing room, Ian McColl, to a huge extent because of that kind of player. Oddly enough, I saw a lovely photograph of him. One fella that reported seeing some of this at play was George Foster. George Foster gets a mention. I can't remember whether it's Len Ashurst or Charlie Hurley's book. George was part of a group of supporters that were painting the huts that used to be at Roker Park, where they would sell scarves and rosettes and programs and stuff. And it seems like it was about 67, 68, that close season. And he talks about watching Baxter arrive late for training. The players would be running round the pitch, and Baxter wouldn't do that and would go and sit and he'd look across, and there would be Baxter chatting with Ian McColl whilst all the players were doing their fitness work, And Len Ashurst described him in that close season. He called him Lord Lucan because he disappeared. And when he did reappear, he'd put on loads and loads of weight. He always had this issue in his, I'm going to say later years, but that he wasn't. Baxter was probably finished playing by the time he was 31, so he wasn't an old player, Jim Baxter. We're talking about Baxter because McColl's managerial career is tied to Jim Baxter's career. As Baxter descends, as his career descends, so does McColl's at Sunderland. The other issue, the other negative, which is around, which some of you might have heard about, was an alleged anti-Catholic bias. And again, you've got players like Nick Sharkey who were absolutely adamant that that's what that was about. Mike Halliwell was an ex-England winger who was at the club when McColl came in. He the same. There were other players. Harry Hood was a good Scottish player. He went on to have a good career in Scotland after he left Sunderland. But he was a player that suffered when McColl came in. John O'Hare, who McColl sold for buttons to Brian Clough at Derby. I think he got 20,000 for him. Honestly, that lad was worth 100,000 of anybody's money. He was a really bright young player, John O'Hare, and he gave him away. Having played him a bit, he was one of the players that he sort of every so often you'd see O'Hare playing beside Neil Martin up front, but you never felt watching that, even as a young boy. And I like John O'Hare. I really like Neil Martin, and I like John O'Hare, but they just weren't the right partnership. The two of them are two good players, but not the right partnership up front. Nick Sharkey would have been. It was bizarre. I mean, Nick Sharkey, he was sold to Leicester, I think it was, and they were going to play him with up front with Derek Dougan, who was almost the English version of Neil Martin. You know what was going on? Absolutely, what a waste of a player and a talent and a boy, Nick Sharkey, who loved Sunderland and loved playing for Sunderland. You know, it was just a horrendous sort of era in terms of developing the club and developing players. So the anti-Catholic bias was that there seems to be enough circumstantial evidence there to suggest that, there was something going on there. The other thing that was about was because people like Jim McNabb arguably suffered with that anti-Catholic bias, but there was also the players that had been Alan Brown's boys. McColl seemed to want to get them out. We were talking in last week's On This Week, we were talking about that as well, weren't we? Managers who come in and can't see what they've got under their feet. So off Jim McNabb, Martin Harvey, Charlie Hurley, George Hurd. Although Hurd played, McColl was very clear about Hurd's role. McColl had actually had a fallout with Hurd on international duty, and Hurd had never gotten another cap under McColl when he was probably at the height of his powers and worth persevering with internationally. He probably suffered more as Alan Brown's boys rather than any religious bias. Things aren't getting any better. He realizes Baxter has to be sold, and unbelievably, despite the reputation that's common knowledge, I mean, there isn't a big club would buy Baxter. McColl hawks him round every big club, Man United, Spurs, all these clubs. No, they wouldn't consider Baxter as being a player that they would want. Matt Busby didn't want him anywhere near his young boys. Bill Nicholson wouldn't have him at Spurs, even though Dave Mackay put a lot of pressure on for him to bring Baxter. Dave Mackay always thought that Baxter was a great individual player and felt like Bill Nick could have sorted him out, but Nicholson wasn't for taking that challenge on. Unbelievably, Nottingham Forest come in and they've got a new chairman who, I think Sunderland would have taken a knockdown price to get rid of the difficulty. But this lad, this new chairman, I've lost his name for the moment. I think they originally agree the 70,000 fee, and then the chairman ups it to 100,000 so that he can make his name in the press as Forest first chairman that breaks the 100,000 barrier in bringing Baxter to Forest. And ostensibly, you would feel that's the problem gone. But by that point, you're looking around, a lot of damage had been done. A lot of good players had left. Players like Mike Halliwell, Harry Hood, John O'Hare, Colin Suggett was on the point of leaving. I think so. It wasn't a healthy dressing room that was left behind. Alan Brown comes back in when McColl was sacked. It was hotly rumoured that Don Revie was coming. That was the hot take, was Revie was going to leave Leeds and come and join Sunderland. Now, that puts Sunderland, this is where we were as a club. Leeds were clearly doing far better than us, had already made their mark in the first division, but we were still seen as a club that potentially would be bigger than Leeds, and it would be a bigger job. But Revie didn't come, and Alan Brown stepped back in, and as Asher says, it was chalk and cheese. You go from the sublime, if you want to, from the ridiculous to the sublime in terms of a disciplinarian and somebody whose word was law. That in itself brings its own problems. So for me, a real opportunity lost. He was given money. He clearly had something. He had an ability. McColl, when he came, he'd done marvellously with the Scottish international team. If he made an error, it was Hitch and his start and Baxter. And it just turned into a real, what could you call it? A real shit show. Sunderland are back in the first division. We had players, we had young players coming through. We had some great young players coming through. Fantastic young players. We had some good players at the club. That was a squad that could have been moulded. Something could have been done with that squad. And it was a total opportunity missed. And it knocked us back. It knocked us back years, because Alan Brown did come back in. The club there wasn't a great willingness to spend money. All the money that had been made from the sale of Neil Martin and Baxter, the board had let McColl spend quite a lot of that money, and it was poorly spent. It was badly spent, and opportunity missed again in many respects. So a sad period that needed to end. It probably should have ended a lot sooner than it did. And when you guys are talking about your first days watching Sunderland, they were my first days. My first 2.5 years, 3 years were spent in the McColl era watching that. And don't get us wrong, as a young boy, I used to run out onto our Clarty backfield, and I was always Jim Baxter in my head. On the pitch, there were still moments, there were still games where that lad showed you what he was about. But it just didn't happen enough, and it should have been curtailed sooner for the good of the club, and it wasn't. And as I say, I felt opportunity lost, and it knocked us back for arguably another decade before we got ourselves reasonably sorted out again. Always regret Neil Martin going. He was a fine player, and by the time at which he left, I was just about old enough to appreciate what I could see. It wasn't just about him scoring goals. He was a great hold-up centre forward. He could be a battering ram. He was reasonably quick over the ground. He had 2 feet. He could pass the ball. He was a cracking centre forward, a world-class centre forward was what he was. But he left to go to Coventry. That's how bad things were. He went to Coventry, who were in the middle of a dogfight. They were relegation fodder as well, and he left there. I think he just had enough of all the shenanigans, So Hard to know what else to say about it. A very, very disappointing period to be for Sunderland. A hard period for the fans who, when Baxter had come in, I kid you not, the excitement about that world-class appointment. I think a long time ago on this pod, I said it would be like us signing Messi or Ronaldo. He was a world star, Baxter, but he was behind the scenes. It was a nightmare, and McColl couldn't deal with it.
No, I think you've indulged in your therapy session there, Kelvin. I think we've all had them over the course of these podcasts, haven't we? And I think that is yours. Although my first manager was Laurie McMenemy, so I'm not sure who got the best or worst deal out of that. But
There's a bit of a contest there. Of course, you lads can't see me at the moment, but I'm actually sitting with a bucket on my head right now.
That's to hide your Turkish hairdo, I think, isn't it?
Hey.
I think an interesting thing which I hadn't considered before with Ian McColl, it's that marked difference between being an international manager and going into club management. It's easy to kind of overlook that's his first club management job. And the skills required to deal with people day in, day out, hour in, hour out, are vastly different to what's required as an international manager. So it's a completely different skill set. And some of the things that you've talked about there are somebody who isn't confident in their ability to manage people day in, day out and longer term.
And he was a bright, articulate fella, He was, when he left football, after that job, he never worked in football again.
No.
He was an engineer, a graduate of Glasgow University, an engineer. He worked as a civil engineer. He worked as a coal merchant. And then he ran a guest house in beautiful Milnagarvey, if you've ever been there. It's a bonny, bonny place. But he never worked in football again. And your observation, Martin, is Lenny Ashurst's observation, is it was the difference between international football as it was then.
Yeah.
Because in many respects, you were making recommendations to a committee who picked the team. And in a lot of respects, you're one step removed when you do that. You don't have to really, you're not taking responsibility for it, are you? You make your recommendations and it's the committee who decide. And that he just didn't have I think his phraseology was the skin. Ashurst said he didn't have the skin for coping with the day-to-day hurly-burly of club management. Interesting coming from Ashurst when you think you think that less than 17 years later he might have had some of the same accusations leveled at him, but I don't think anybody would say he didn't have the puggy for the fight, There weren't too many people would say that about Ashurst. He'd go toe-to-toe, whereas McColl didn't seem to want to involve himself in that. So, you're right. Terrible period for the club. Terrible.
Well, on that bright note, we will wrap it up for this week, won't we? Andrew, do you have a quiz question that you would like to share with the listeners before we depart?
Yes, I'll be very quick because I've got to flee, and unless I'm able to remove the hands from my manager's clock, he's not going to be impressed at me turning up for a site meeting very late. So the quiz question, very quickly, we have already spoken about his teammate Darren Byfield in reference to the quiz ahead of this episode. Next week, we will take a look at Marcus Stewart, because on the 12th of February 2005, he scored a hat-trick at home, and hoping people will have an idea of who that was against.
There we go. That is one for everyone to ponder on over the coming days. So all that remains for us to do is say goodbye to Andrew, who's got to rush off to do his proper job.
Yes, cheers. It's about time I did some work, I think.
Good man, and thank you very much for all that, Kelvin. We will see you next week.
Lovely. Thanks for the therapy session, lads.
That's what we're all here for, isn't it? All of us and the listeners. I'm sure there'll be plenty of people listening to that who remember all of those ins and outs and some of those details that you shared and feel a lot better for having listened to you. Get that off your chest. We will be back tomorrow with another episode of How We Hear the Podcast. But until then, it's goodbye from us.
Find the biggest voices in sports on the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Like the Nat Coon Show, your go-to NFL pod with some of the biggest names in American football. The regular season is done. The race for the Super Bowl is on. So now it is win or go home, and we have got you covered. Smart takes, big guests, and all the drama you can handle as the race to make it to Santa Clara heats up. So search the Nat Coon Show and listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Sports Social Podcast Network.